It is the 1st of July, 1944. On Subačiaus Street, on the eastern edge of Vilnius, roughly 350 Jewish men, women, and children stand in the courtyard of a converted apartment block, waiting for a German major to speak. The Red Army is less than 20 kilometers away. Artillery rumbles on the horizon like distant thunder that never quite breaks. Standing before them is Major Karl Plagge, commander of Heereskraftfahrpark 562, a Wehrmacht vehicle repair unit that has, for reasons none of them fully understand, kept them alive for the better part of a year, while 100,000 of their fellow Lithuanian Jews have been murdered in the forest at Ponary, a few kilometers to the south. Beside Plagge stands an SS officer named Richter. Plagge clears his throat and announces that his unit has been ordered to withdraw westwards, and that regrettably he has not been able to secure permission to take his workers with him. Then, almost as an afterthought, he adds a line that survivors would remember for the rest of their lives, that everybody present knows how conscientiously the SS looks after its Jewish prisoners. It is not what he says, it is what he does not say, and what everyone in that courtyard understands him to mean. Within hours, prisoners are prising up floorboards, climbing into cavities behind false walls, squeezing into spaces built over months in anticipation of exactly this moment. The camp they leave behind will, in a matter of days, become a killing ground. But because of that one carefully coded warning, roughly 250 people will still be alive when the Red Army marches into Vilnius less than a fortnight later. This is the story of a German army major, a Nazi party member, a man who never fired a shot in anger against his own government, and who nonetheless became one of the most effective rescuers of Jewish lives in the entire history of the Holocaust. It matters because it asks an uncomfortable question that most war stories prefer to avoid. How much could have been done by how many people within the machinery of the Third Reich itself if only they had chosen to look for the room to maneuver? By the summer of 1941, Vilnius was already being called the Jerusalem of Lithuania, a city whose Jewish community numbered around 70,000 people, with synagogues, libraries, printing houses, and a cultural life stretching back centuries. Then the Wehrmacht arrived, and within months the machinery of annihilation followed close behind. Einsatzgruppen death squads, assisted with grim enthusiasm by Lithuanian auxiliary units, began marching Jews out to the killing pits at Ponary in their thousands. By late 1941, tens of thousands had already been shot. The ghetto that remained was a temporary reprieve rather than a place of safety, and everyone inside it understood the arithmetic. There was only one thing that offered even a sliver of protection: a work permit declaring you essential to the German war economy. This was the loophole, and it was a desperately narrow one. German military units across the occupied East were permitted to employ Jewish forced laborers on the grounds that skilled workers, mechanics, and tradesmen were too valuable to the war effort to be liquidated alongside everyone else. In practice, this permission was applied with brutal inconsistency. Some units treated their Jewish laborers as expendable, worked them to death, or handed them over to the SS the moment production quotas allowed. The certificates themselves, printed on flimsy paper and stamped with an eagle and swastika, carried no guarantee. They could be revoked, ignored, or simply overridden the moment the SS decided a ghetto's usefulness had expired. And by the spring of 1943, following the uprising in the Warsaw Ghetto, Heinrich Himmler had concluded that the ghettos of the East represented more of a security risk than an economic asset. He ordered their liquidation, labor value notwithstanding. For the Jews of Vilna, this meant that even holding a certificate no longer meant survival. The system that offered the only sliver of hope was being dismantled from above, and no one inside the ghetto had the power to stop it. Into this situation stepped a 51-year-old army engineer named Karl Plagge. Born in Darmstadt in 1897, he had served as a young soldier in the trenches of the First World War, been wounded, and returned home to study mechanical engineering. Like millions of Germans in the aftermath of that catastrophic defeat, He watched his country slide into economic collapse, and in 1931 he joined the Nazi Party, believing, as he later explained, that it offered the best chance of rebuilding Germany. It is worth sitting with that fact rather than rushing past it, because Plagge was no secret resistor, no undercover agent, no man hiding a double life. He was a convinced party member for several years, but he was also a lecturer at a technical college. The unit arrived in Vilnius in the summer of 1941, and Plagge began hiring workers from inside the ghetto to staff his repair workshops on Olandu Street. He was, by every surviving account, strikingly unconcerned with whether these workers actually possessed mechanical skills. Hairdressers, shoemakers, butchers, teachers all found themselves issued certificates identifying them as essential vehicle technicians. It was, on paper, an administrative fiction. In practice, it was a lifeline, and Plagge extended it as widely as the SS would tolerate, and sometimes a little further than that. When the ghetto's final liquidation was ordered in September 1943, Plagge did something almost unheard of among Wehrmacht officers. He traveled first to Army headquarters in Kaunas and then on to the SS administration in Riga to argue, against considerable resistance, for permission to establish an independent camp for his workers, one where wives and children could remain alongside the men. His stated justification was entirely practical, even cynical on the surface, that men separated from their families made poor, demoralized workers, and that keeping families intact would improve productivity. Whatever the underlying reasoning, the argument worked. On the evening of the 16th of September, 1943, Plagge personally drove a convoy of lorries into the ghetto and loaded more than 1,200 men, women, and children aboard, transporting them to two requisitioned apartment blocks on Subačiaus Street that would become known as HKP 562. Compared with almost any other forced labor camp under German control, conditions at HKP 562 were strange, almost inexplicable. Plagge issued standing orders that the civilians under his authority were to be treated with respect. He rotated out subordinates who showed particular cruelty towards Jewish workers, reassigning them away from any contact with the camp. Food rations, though still meager, were quietly supplemented, and a blind eye was turned towards the black market that kept people from starving, an offense that in the ghetto had carried a death sentence. Working hours ran to a punishing 12 hours a day, but no prisoner is recorded as having died of hunger inside the camp, a claim that stands in stark contrast to almost every comparable facility in occupied Europe. When the SS complained that the women and children appeared idle and therefore expendable, Plagge brought in sewing machines and set up clothing repair workshops on the upper floors of the apartment blocks, manufacturing a justification for their continued existence out of nothing more than paperwork and persistence. None of this made HKP 562 safe. It made it survivable, which in the Vilna of 1943 was an almost unimaginable distinction. The protection Plagge offered was never absolute, and the record of HKP 562 is not a simple story of rescue. The camp remained officially SS property, administered day-to-day by Plagge's Wehrmacht engineers, but ultimately subject to the security police whenever they chose to assert authority. On several occasions they did so with horrifying results. In March 1944, while Plagge was away visiting family in Germany, SS officer Martin Weiss oversaw what became known as the Kinderaction, storming the camp and seizing the majority of its roughly 250 children who were taken away and murdered. It was a devastation that Plagge, by every account, was powerless to prevent and deeply affected by afterwards. Survivors remembered him differently from other officers who passed through their lives during the war. Pearl Good, who was a child in the camp, later recalled that he never struck anyone and treated them, in her words, like human beings. That such a simple standard of behavior could register as extraordinary tells its own story about the world these people were living through. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. And there is more of this story still to come. It is worth placing Plagge's actions alongside the handful of other documented cases of German officers using positions of military authority to shield Jewish lives, because the comparison sharpens exactly what made his approach distinctive. Oskar Schindler, whose story became far more widely known through film, operated as a factory owner exploiting cheap Jewish labor, who gradually, and at enormous personal financial risk, turned his enamelware and munitions plants into a genuine sanctuary, ultimately protecting around 1,200 workers on his own lists. Schindler operated largely outside the military hierarchy, as a civilian entrepreneur, bribing and maneuvering around SS officials. Plagge, by contrast, operated entirely from within the Wehrmacht chain of command, using the ordinary bureaucratic language of labor requisitions and productivity reports as his cover, never once framing his actions as defiance. Sergeant Anton Schmid, stationed in the same city, sheltered Jewish families and helped smuggle others to safety using his own transport authority before being arrested, court-martialed, and executed by the Germans in April 1942. Schmid's courage was direct and unmistakably deliberate, and it cost him his life within months. Plagge's method was different again, slower, more bureaucratic, dressed at every stage in the language of military necessity rather than moral conviction, which is precisely what allowed it to continue, largely undetected, for nearly a year. Historians studying Wehrmacht conduct on the Eastern Front have noted how vanishingly rare this combination was. The overwhelming majority of German officers in occupied Lithuania either participated actively in the killing, looked away entirely, or at best did nothing more than avoid direct involvement. Of the roughly 100,000 Jews living in Vilnius before the German occupation, only around 2,000 survived the war. The single largest group among that remnant, more than any other rescue effort, ghetto hiding network, or partisan escape route combined, came out of Plagge's camp. What Plagge achieved was never total, and he would have been the first to say so. Historians estimate that his interventions, direct and indirect, allowed somewhere in the region of 1,250 people to pass through HKP 562 under his protection at its height, and that around 250 survived to see liberation, a devastating gap between the two figures that reflects the limits of what one officer, working within a genocidal system rather than openly against it, could actually accomplish. The historian Kim Primel has described Plagge's method as operating within a genuine gray zone, a position that required constant moral compromise, cooperation with a murderous regime dressed in the language of loyalty to it, precisely in order to preserve the narrow space in which any rescue at all remained possible. He did not resign his commission. He did not sabotage his unit's operations. He did not smuggle weapons to partisans in the surrounding forests, as some accounts of wartime heroism might lead you to expect. He filled in forms. He argued about productivity figures with SS administrators in Riga. He rotated cruel subordinates to other duties rather than confronting them directly. It was, by any conventional definition, an unheroic method, and it saved more lives in Vilnius than almost any other single rescue effort of the entire war. After leading his unit westward in the final chaotic weeks of the German retreat, Plagge surrendered to American forces on the 2nd of May, 1945, without a single casualty among his men. Because he had joined the Nazi Party as early as 1931 and had commanded a camp where hundreds of prisoners had ultimately been murdered by the SS, he found himself facing an Allied denazification tribunal in 1947, a legal process built to strip former party members of their positions and privileges rather than to weigh individual acts of quiet resistance. It might easily have ended his story in disgrace. Instead, word of the hearing reached survivors scattered through displaced persons camps across occupied Germany. Former prisoners of HKP 562 living in a camp at Ludwigsburg contacted a local schoolteacher named Maria Eikemueller after reading a newspaper account of the trial, and she in turn came forward to testify on Plagge's behalf. The tribunal, weighing his party membership against the testimony of the people he had saved, ultimately classified him as a fellow traveler rather than an active Nazi, accepting that his actions had sprung from humanitarian instinct rather than political opposition to the regime he had served. He was not formally exonerated. He never sought recognition for what he had done, and he rarely spoke of the war for the rest of his life. He died in Darmstadt in June 1957, a decade after the trial, largely unknown outside the small circle of survivors who remembered him. The physical evidence of what happened at HKP 562 has proven remarkably durable. In the years since Plagge's story became widely known, archaeological teams working with geoscientists and historians have surveyed the ground around the Subačiaus Street buildings, mapping the molinas, the hidden cavities behind false walls and beneath floorboards, where survivors spent days in near-total silence waiting for the SS search parties to move on. Ground-penetrating radar and other non-invasive techniques have helped confirm details that for decades existed only in the fragmentary memories of aging survivors, memories that were, in several cases, recorded only in the final years of those survivors' lives. Sidney Handler, who was 10 years old when he hid in one of the camp's attics, later gave testimony describing the sound of a machine gun burst in the courtyard below, followed by silence, a memory that has since become one of the clearest surviving eyewitness accounts of the camp's final days. Without that generation of survivors coming forward when they did, much of this record would almost certainly have been lost entirely, since Plagge himself left behind no memoir, no detailed private account of his reasoning, only the bare outline of his actions, and a handful of post-war letters. It would take nearly half a century for the wider world to learn his name. In the year 2000, the son of an HKP survivor, Michael Good, began piecing together his mother's fragmentary wartime memories, tracking down archival records and locating the handful of remaining witnesses before their testimony was lost for good. His research became the book, The Search for Major Plagge, and it was this reconstruction, built from survivor accounts, prisoner rosters preserved by the Lithuanian State Jewish Museum, and post-war trial records, that finally brought Plagge's story before Yad Vashem. After 2 earlier petitions had failed for lack of documentary evidence, the memorial recognized Karl Plagge as one of the righteous among the nations in 2005, 48 years after his death. Today, the apartment blocks on Subačiaus Street still stand in Vilnius, largely unchanged, and visitors can walk the same courtyard where 350 people once stood listening for the meaning hidden inside an officer's carefully chosen words. The story has since informed academic work on the moral behavior of ordinary soldiers under totalitarian command, and it continues to trouble a simple binary that popular memory often prefers, the notion that every man in German uniform was either a monster or a bystander, with nothing in between. Return for a moment to that courtyard on the 1st of July, 1944. A major stands before several hundred people whose lives depend on the precise shading of a sentence he is not permitted to speak plainly. He does not draw a weapon. He does not denounce the SS officer standing at his shoulder. He says a handful of ordinary words about conscientious guards, and then he turns and walks away, leaving the rest to be understood. It is not the kind of moment that documentaries usually build towards. No gunfire, no chase, no final confrontation. It is quieter than that and in some ways more unsettling, because it suggests that the machinery of genocide was not an unbreakable wall, but a system built and operated by individual men, each one making choices, most of them choosing complicity, a small number choosing something else. Karl Plagge joined the Nazi Party out of conviction and left it out of conscience. He commanded a forced labor camp built on the same racial ideology that murdered 100,000 of his neighbor's fellow citizens, and he spent 3 years quietly working to deny that ideology as many victims as his rank and his nerve allowed. He saved perhaps 250 lives directly, out of a Jewish community of 100,000 that was almost entirely destroyed. Both of those facts are true at once, and neither cancels the other out. He never called what he did courage. He called it, in a letter written a year before his death, nothing more than the ordinary moral feeling that exists in all human beings, waiting only to be drawn upon. The tragedy of Karl Plagge's story is not that one man managed to do this. It is that so few others standing in similar positions of quiet, unglamorous authority ever tried.